Hi, and welcome to Really Understanding Incoterms 2020, a series of comprehensive masterclasses. This is lesson number 17, CFR Cost and Freight, Named Port of Destination. But first, the necessary disclaimer. I am not a lawyer. The contents of this course are not legal advice. I was a member of the International Chamber of Commerce's Incoterms 2020 drafting group, which created these rules. Some of the contents in this lesson are direct quotes from the Incoterms 2020 publication number 723E of the ICC. My explanations, my comments and my opinions are based on my knowledge and my experience of over 5 decades. My intent in creating this comprehensive course on Incoterms 2020 is to ensure that my knowledge and my experience is passed on to you for a better future for you in trade. In this lesson, we'll look specifically at CFR. The more complex articles, A2 and B2, delivery, taking delivery, A6 and B6, delivery, transport document, A9, B9, allocation of costs, A10, B10 notices. In the following lesson, we'll look at CIF's insurance A5 and B5 and A9, B9 allocation of costs, and how CFR and CIF both work with letters of credit transactions. I'll explain what the book says first, which is where the other trainers and YouTube videos usually stop, if they even go that far, but then I will examine the issues arising from these articles as we go along. A2, delivery. The seller must deliver the goods, either by placing them on board the vessel or by procuring the goods so delivered. In either case, the seller must deliver the goods on the agreed date or within the agreed period and in the manner customary at the port. It's essential to understand that delivery means on board the vessel. It does not mean when the vessel eventually leaves the port of loading, even though the seller contracted for carriage. It also does not mean arrival at the named port of destination. As we saw in A3, risk of loss or damage to the goods transfers to the buyer at the moment of delivery, not on arrival at the destination port. It's worth noting that this rule makes no mention at all about which port of loading or any point within the port of loading. This is because the seller is delivering to the vessel it contracted. If the port of loading is important to the buyer, such as for free trade agreements, etc., then it should be mentioned in the contract. B2, taking delivery. The buyer must take delivery of the goods when they have been delivered under A2 and receive them from the carrier at the named port of destination. In this rule, there are 2 critical points. The port of loading, where delivery on board the vessel occurs, and the port of destination, where the buyer must receive the goods from the carrier or vessel. Many people incorrectly think because the destination place is named after CFR and CIF, that is where delivery occurs. Not so. Delivery occurs when the seller has loaded the goods on board the vessel at the port of loading. Risk of loss or damage to the goods between the port of loading and destination is the buyer's because, as we saw in A3, it transfers at delivery, a point worth emphasising. The use of carrier in CFR means vessel's owner or master because there usually is not actually a carrier such as a freight forwarder. or of course a container shipping line. A6, delivery transport document. The seller must, at its own cost, provide the buyer with the usual transport document for the agreed port of destination. This transport document must cover the contract goods, be dated within the period agreed for shipment, enable the buyer to claim the goods from the carrier at the port of destination and, unless otherwise agreed, enable the buyer to sell the goods in transit by the transfer of the document to a subsequent buyer or by notification to the carrier. When such a transport document is issued in negotiable form and in several originals, a full set of originals must be presented to the buyer. So let's examine this. The seller must, at its own cost, provide the buyer with the usual transport document for the agreed port of destination. This will usually be an onboard charter party bill of lading, but could be a seaway bill. It usually will be signed by the vessel's agent at the port of loading on behalf of the vessel's master, the captain, or less often on behalf of the vessel owner. If allowed by the charter party, it can even be signed by the charterer. This transport document must cover the contract goods, be dated within the period agreed for shipment. Contract goods refers in this case to the brief general description of the goods. Adding as per contract XYZ 987 in the description on the bill of lading is pointless. Adding excessive detail of the goods, such as part numbers, styles, or grades, or oil contents, or whatever might be relevant to the goods generally, is pointless on a bill of lading. Shipment here means delivery on board, not vessel departure. The vessel could be damaged or sink at its moorings immediately after loading. Enable the buyer to claim the goods from the carrier at the port of destination and, unless otherwise agreed, enable the buyer to sell the goods in transit by the transfer of the document to a subsequent buyer or by notification to the carrier. A charter party bill of lading consigned to order or to order of XYZ is a negotiable bill of lading, enabling transfer to a subsequent buyer. Or by notification of the carrier means the seller's authority to the master or owner of the vessel to hand the goods over without presentation of a bill of lading, such as in a prepaid transaction. When such a transport document is issued in negotiable form and in several originals, a full set of originals must be presented to the buyer. A charter party bill of lading will usually be issued in a stated number of originals, quote, any one of which being accomplished, the others shall be void. This instruction then prevents the seller from having the bill of lading issued in several originals consigned to order, then selling the same goods to multiple buyers just by handing each of them one of the originals. It also indicates that the habit of some sellers to keep one of the originals just in case is unacceptable. B6, delivery transport document. The buyer must accept the transport document provided under A6 if it is in conformity with the contract. Reference to the transport document being in conformity with the contract is a little odd because most contracts say very little on this. It's actually lawyer speak, and maybe it would have been clearer to reflect A6 in B6 and say in plain English, quote, if it evidences transport of the contract goods to the agreed port of destination within the delivery period agreed for shipment. A9. Allocation of costs. The seller must pay A. All costs relating to the goods until they have been delivered in accordance with A2, other than those payable by the buyer under B9. The seller must pay B. The freight and all other costs resulting from A4, including the costs of loading the goods on board and transport-related security costs. The seller must pay C. Any charges for unloading at the agreed port of discharge that were for the seller's account under the contract of carriage. The seller must pay D. The costs of transit that were for the seller's account under the contract of carriage. The seller must pay E. The costs of providing the usual proof to the buyer under A6 that the goods have been delivered. The seller must pay F, where applicable, duties, taxes and any other costs related to export clearance under A7A, and G, the seller must pay the buyer for all costs and charges related to providing assistance in obtaining documents and information in accordance with B7A. We'll examine a little of this. The seller pays all costs up to when the goods have been loaded on board the vessel. The seller pays all charges at the port of loading. The seller pays all the costs of carriage to the port of destination. The seller pays port of destination charges, such as tugs and berthing. Who pays unloading and wharfage charges will depend on the contract, and thus the contract of carriage, typically based on the type of goods, facilities at the port of destination, and vessel's own equipment, if any. So the buyer must pay under allocation of costs, A, all costs relating to the goods from the time they have been delivered under A2, other than those payable by the seller under A9. The buyer must pay B, the costs of transit, unless such costs were for the seller's account under the contract of carriage. The buyer must pay C, unloading costs, including lighterage and wharfage charges, unless such costs and charges were for the seller's account under the contract of carriage. The buyer must pay D, the seller, for all costs and charges related to providing assistance in obtaining documents and information in accordance with A5 and A7B, for example, for the buyer to arrange their own insurance, certificates of origin, etc. The buyer must pay E, where applicable, duties, taxes and any other costs related to transit or import clearance under B7B, and the buyer must pay F, any additional costs incurred if it fails to give notice in accordance with B10, which we'll see, from the agreed date or the end of the agreed period for shipment, provided that the goods have been clearly identified as the contract goods. So A10 notices the seller must notify the buyer that the goods have been delivered in accordance with A2. The seller must give the buyer any notice required to enable the buyer to receive the goods. The seller must notify the buyer that the goods have been delivered in accordance with A2. Now, usually this is email advices before and after delivery on board. The seller must give the buyer any notice required to enable the buyer to receive the goods. Usually this will be the original charter party bill of lading. Logically, the buyer must specify the port of destination and any point within it. In the case of a long-term contract with several shipments, the buyer might determine when they want the goods shipped to match their production scheduling. And for short transit shipments, this gives the buyer more control. The buyer might require shipment to one or more of a range of ports. All of these avoid the need to amend the actual contract of sale. In our next lesson, we'll examine where CIF differs from CFR, A5 and B5 insurance, A9 and B9 allocation of costs. Then we'll look at how CFR and CIF both work with letters of credit transactions. I'll explain what the book says first, and then I'll examine the issues arising as we go along. If you like this lesson, please click on the thumbs up button below. If you'd like to be alerted to each new lesson, please hit the subscribe button and the bell. And please leave any comments and questions relevant to this lesson below. See you next lesson.